It's wonderful to be here, and Dan asked me to just give you a very quick presentation first. Remember, I'm a statistics professor. I actually think statistics is fun. I think they're a little sexy. I'm pretty sure most people don't agree with me, but they are the things that are actually telling us what does the world look like. And so I'd like to show you just a few things about climate, because it is an important conversation. It's one that you're going to have for a very long time. It might be good to have some good arguments. So look, first of all, global warming, it's real, it's man-made. I think this is not the conversation that you want to have. It's absolutely true that there is a problem, but it's often vastly exaggerated. And I just want to show you a few things of how it is exaggerated, and then I'll move on to how we're not fixing it, and then at the very end, how we should be fixing it. So, for instance, we often hear about hurricanes. We certainly heard about Hurricane Ian just a few weeks ago, and we are constantly being told there are more and more hurricanes, they're more and more ferocious, and the evidence just doesn't tell us that. If you look at all the hurricanes that we know from the US, remember again, it's very easy to see an increase in the number of hurricanes if you look at the number of hurricanes that satellites are spotting, because back in times of old, there were no satellites. So it's not very surprising that we're seeing more and more. So when you see, for instance, the Financial Times telling you there are more and more hurricanes, that's because there were nobody counting back in time of old, and now there are lots and lots of very advanced satellites counting. That's why we look at the number of landfalling hurricanes, and the US has by far the best statistics, and what that tells us is the landfalling hurricanes since 1900 have not increased. Actually, they've slightly decreased. It's not such that we're seeing more and more hurricanes. We're actually seeing slightly fewer. Now, a lot of people will then tell you, but they're getting stronger. Now, it's true that we expect in the future that we'll actually see fewer hurricanes, but slightly stronger hurricanes. And overall, that is a problem. That's why, one of the many reasons why global warming is a real problem. But that's not what we've seen so far. If you look at the major hurricanes, so Category 3 and above, again, it's been dropping, not increasing. Actually, note also the very, I'm not sure where to point here, over there, the 11 years that there were no strong hurricanes that hit the US, unprecedented. Again, you can't just have a conversation where we hear about, there's a hurricane, oh my God, it's global warming. But when there are no hurricanes, it's not a problem. We can't have that kind of a conversation. That's why you need to know these things. Likewise, if you look at heat waves and cold waves, we hear a lot of things about how there are more and more heat waves. And that is reasonable. As temperatures rise, we would expect to see more and more heat waves, and hence more and more people also dying from heat. That's an important issue. But let's just get a sense of this. This is the best data that we have from The Lancet, one of the best journals in the world. They tried to look at how many people die from heat and from cold. Now, I'm going to show you both of them. So up the y-axis, you actually see excess number of deaths and percent of global deaths. So about 60 million people die every year on the planet, and they're saying how many percent die from heat. From 2000 and up to 2019, this is what they found. More and more people die from heat. This is definitely an argument of saying, wow, that's something we should take seriously. That's something we should actually be somewhat concerned about. So we saw an increase of 0.21 percentage points. That translated into 116,000 more people die every year over the last 20 years because temperature rise. That's definitely a problem. But you, again, can't just talk about one side and not look at the other side, because actually, we don't just have heat deaths, and the attendant 116,000 more heat deaths, but we also have cold deaths. And cold deaths have decreased much more. And remember also, cold deaths almost everywhere on the planet, even sub-Saharan Africa, kill way more people. So we see about 4.5 million people dying from cold, whereas it's only about 500,000 that dies from heat. And because it's gone down much further, we've actually seen 283,000 fewer deaths from cold. You can't just say, oh my God, there are more people dying from heat, without also realizing there are fewer people dying from cold, and many fewer people. So actually, each year, in the first 20 years of this decade, we've actually seen increasing temperatures, we've seen increasing number of people dying from heat, but many fewer dying from cold, which is why overall rising temperatures have saved 166,000 people every year. We should know that. Again, this does not mean that there's no problem with global warming, but it simply means we're not well informed if we only hear one side of the story. I would argue one of the reasons we get this so wrong on climate is because we constantly ignore adaptation. Humans actually adapt. You know, when sea levels rise, which they will do, and that will be a problem with climate change, it's not like they're going to stand around and say, wow, my knees are wet. Eventually I'll drown, and then water rises, and eventually you drown. People move, or they put up seawalls. And of course, that's why we've actually seen a dramatic decline in the number of deaths, not increases. If you look at the last 100 years, we have pretty good data from the International Disaster Database. From the 1920s, on average, almost 500,000 people died every year from climate-related deaths, so that's floods, droughts, storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures. So 500,000 up there. Since then, most people would probably believe that it's going up. It's not. It's going down. It's going down dramatically. So that last decade, the 2010s, 18,000 people died every year. We've seen a reduction of almost 99%. And at the same time, of course, humanity has quadrupled in size. So our individual risk has decreased by much more than 99%. Why? Because we're rich. When you're rich, you're much better able to deal with the issues. You're much more resilient. So again, we need to recognize this is not a disaster that's just getting out of hand. Actually, what we're seeing is a dramatic decline, and we've actually also seen that for 2020, it's even lower, and even for 2021, which I bet many of you heard as the biggest catastrophe ever. Yes, there were the heat dome, there was the floods in Germany and Belgium, and many other places, but if you add all of them up, it's less than 7,000 people. We need to know these things. And that's why I just want to show you very quickly that our current policies are based on something that can really only be described as wishful thinking. So most people think renewables are just going to take over and be the be all and all. I was getting that wrong on how to say that. English is not my first language. I'm just going to apologize for that. Anyway, so back in time of old, in 1800, we got almost everything from renewables, right? 94%. Since then, for the last 2 centuries, we've been getting off renewables. So much so that the last 50 years have been pretty stable at around 13 to 14%. What we're now seeing is an increase because a lot of politicians are putting a lot of money to getting us towards renewables. But renewables are nowhere near actually going to solve the problem. If you look at what the International Energy Agency estimate, by 2050, the world will be at 28%, at very, very high cost, of course. Renewables are not taking over anytime soon. We've spent 200 years getting rid of them, and it will take a very long time to get back to renewables. Just you can actually see this as a linear curve. It'll mean that it'll get to 100% only in the 23rd century. We're nowhere near. And we need to recognize that. We're going to be using fossil fuels for a very long time to come. And so we should perhaps start thinking about how do we deal with this most effectively. I'm just going to skip the next 2 slides. Sorry, because I want to make sure we have time enough. And just get to what should we do? Well, fundamentally, we are not tackling climate change very well. We're spending trillions of dollars on policies that'll do almost no good. So I would like to share with you some of the things. I run a think tank called the Copenhagen Consensus, where we bring together more than 300 of the world's top economists, 7 Nobel laureates in economics, to try to look at where can you spend a dollar and do the very most good. The answer is you should spend it where it's very effective. Where's that in climate? Well, it turns out we know a lot of things that don't work. So, for instance, the EU 2020 policy, which was reduced 20% below 1990 levels by 2020, which is one of the most well-studied climate policies, turned out that it was incredibly expensive and help very, very little. We estimate that for every dollar you spend, you avoid about 3 cents of climate damage in the long run. That's a really bad deal, right? I mean, you could have just given away the dollar mostly to poor people in the third world, and you would have done 97 cents more good. That's a really bad idea. The Paris Agreement, which you may have heard of, again, it's a little better because we got more countries on board. Many developing countries also promised some things, not all that much, but it's still not a very good idea. You're still spending $1 and just avoiding 11 cents of climate damage. If you get a smart global carbon tax, and this might be one of the places there where some people here will disagree, but all economists will tell you that a carbon tax, essentially a way that you pay for the pollution that you put out, is a smart idea. It's an effective way to deal with this, and one of the only guy to win the Nobel Prize in Climate Economics, William Nordhaus, shows that this is actually a good deal. It's not a fantastic deal. There's a lot of ways you can do it badly, but it'll probably deliver about $2 back on the dollar. But, and this is the important part, this will not solve very much of global warming. So how do we fix climate? We fix climate like we fixed all other issues in the world, through innovation. If you think about the big problems that humanity has faced, we've never solved it by telling everyone, I'm sorry, could you just do with less? Could you feel a little more depressed? Could you be a little more cold and uncomfortable? Of course, people are not going to vote for that. If you think about it, back in the 70s, we were basically really worried that a large part of the world was running out of food. So India, it was really not Africa back then. Africa was more in the 1980s. But we worried a lot about a lot of places in the world that wouldn't be able to feed themselves. The answer was not to tell everyone, I'm sorry, could you eat a little less, sir, and send that down to the third world? That'll never work. Instead, what we did was the Green Revolution. We designed seeds that basically produce 3 times more food on every acre. That's how you fix the problem. That's why India has now gone from being a basket case in the 1960s and 70s to being a fantastic place, the world's leading rice exporter. That's how you do it. Think about Los Angeles in the 1950s. Los Angeles was terribly polluted, and mostly from cars. The sort of standard climate answer to that would be to say, I'm sorry, could you guys just, keep your cars in the garage and just walk or run? And of course, you'd never get away with doing that. But fundamentally, the point is you cannot tell people we can only solve this problem by inconveniencing you. Instead, the catalytic converter that was invented in 1974 is essentially a little gizmo you put on the exhaust pipe of your car. Yeah, it costs a couple $100, but then you can drive around and not pollute. That's how we'll fix climate change. Imagine, for instance, Bill Gates is investing in 4th-generation nuclear power, and he's saying, and many others are saying, that it'll be incredibly cheap and incredibly safe, and we'll all want them. They'll be very, very cheap and simple to put up. I don't know whether that's going to be true, but the amazing thing is, if that was true, we'd all just buy them. Not just rich, well-meaning Americans and Europeans, but also the Chinese, the Indians, the Africans. And so the reality here is the only way we're going to fix climate change is through innovation, which is what we've fixed with all other things in the world. We've fixed them not by telling people you have to do with less, you have to freeze a little more, you have to be a little more inconvenienced. Instead, we do this through innovation. So we should be spending a lot more on innovation. And if we did, every dollar spent would do $11 worth of good. So that was a little statistics lesson, and I think Dan is going to come out now, and then we'll have a talk, and I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bjorn. And thank you for flying out here. I really appreciate it. The kids are excited to see you. This is an important discussion. Most young Republicans are concerned about the environment, concerned about climate change, and so it's important to step into that arena and actually talk about it. For a long time, the Republican Party was just like, nope, doesn't exist. Well, I mean, it certainly doesn't exist the way the left says it exists, right? There's radical environmentalists and there's rational environmentalists, and you're not making the argument that it doesn't exist. In fact, you're making the argument that the scientific consensus is real. It's just not nearly as bad as others are saying. I want you to respond to the following fact. The UN climate report, the IPCC, this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, considered this the gold standard of the scientific consensus. The thing is it doesn't say what people think it says. Like, there's headlines written about it. There's a lot of sensationalist, crisis-oriented headlines written about it, and then there's what it says. And you talk about the cost-benefit approach as how to approach this problem. And it's worth noting that in this report it says, look, the cost of climate change, it's not nothing. But it's only about 4.5% of global GDP is a difference from what it otherwise would be. So in the year 2100, instead of being a 450% increase, it's like 434%. So it's a cost, and it's not nothing, but it's kind of close to nothing, which gets to your graph about like what we should do about it. So respond to the alarmism that we see. Like, I wonder what drives that if it's not the science.
So there's a number of answers to that. One is obviously that if you really think that the end is nigh, you're much more likely to be willing to actually pay up. If global warming was a meteor hurtling towards Earth and we'll all be gone in 12 years, like AOC and many, many others talk about, if that really was true, it would be the only thing we should be worried about. So it makes sense to say, if this is the end of the world, we should all just throw everything in the kitchen sink at it. But it's not. And I just want to emphasize that because I didn't say it, and I don't think anyone got it when you sort of said it again. The UN estimate that by the end of the century, each person on the planet, on this sort of standard middle-of-the-road scenario, each person on the planet will be 450% as rich as he or she is today. That's an amazing achievement.
Just on the trend, just on current economic trends, yeah.
This is basically saying that we're going to be much richer because we're an innovative species and we know how to deal with a lot of issues. This is what we've seen for the last 200 years. Now, global warming is going to make it feel like we're less well off, simply because there'll be a number of problems. There'll also be some good things, but eventually, as you saw, there'll be more heat deaths, but fewer cold deaths. Eventually, we run out of cold deaths to have fewer of, and then we will have more heat deaths. So there will be problems. Overall, a lot of economists spend a very long time trying to find out how much is that. And the answer is, if we do nothing, it's about 4%. So we'll be 4% less well off by the end of the century. It'll feel like, because most of this is not market impacts, it'll feel like we're 4% less well off than we otherwise would have been. So by the end of the century, instead of being 450% as rich, we'll only be 434% as rich. Yeah, that's a problem. It's not the end of the world. It's not a meteor hurtling towards Earth. And this is the conversation that we really need to have. If you look back in time, there has been an enormous number of things that people worried about the world would basically turn out really badly. Of course, it hasn't happened because otherwise we probably wouldn't be here. It's not a good argument that just because it hasn't happened for the last 200 times, it couldn't happen this time. But it happens to be that that's not what the UN Climate Panel report tells us.
And like you said, there's a number of reasons for the alarmism. I think that a very radical part of it is anti-humanist. I mean, they say, don't have babies, you're a scourge on the earth. I mean, they actually talk like that. Now, that's not everybody. And cynically, part of it, too, is I think, special interests. So you mentioned green energy innovation, so I want to ask you what your thoughts are and what kind of green energy you might prefer. I probably know my preferences on this. I'm not against things like solar and wind. Let's just do it where it makes sense. In the US, I think we subsidize solar and wind at least 250 times more per unit of energy than we subsidize nuclear. Does that make sense?
No.
No.
So the fundamental point is we don't know what's going to power the end of the 21st century. But researchers are cheap. Energy, or putting up lots of different energy installations, is very, very expensive. So why don't we focus on cheap researchers? That's the basic point here. It's not to say that we should decide, and politicians have a tendency to sort of go with one thing, and that's the thing that's going to solve the problem. But it could be a million different things. So Craig Venter, the guy who cracked the human genome back in 2000, he has this amazing idea. I love it because it sounds so cool. It doesn't work, by the way, but it might. But his idea is basically take a genetically modified algae, put it out on the ocean surface, and grow it. Out there, it'll soak up sunlight and CO2 and produce oil. Then we'll just harvest it and run our entire fossil fuel economy on this oil, and it'll be CO2 neutral because it just soaked up the CO2 out there. We'll basically be able to grow our own Saudi Arabias out on the ocean surface. How cool would that be? Now, the point is, he can make it work, but it doesn't work in any commercial sense.
Yeah.
But maybe we could make that. There's a ton of these ideas, and we really just need one or a few of them to come through, and those are the ones that'll power the 21st century. So again, it's not about saying, we don't know how to make this work, but it's simply about saying, let's not be so panicked that we have to do the technologies that we have right now. Because as you know, solar and wind, sure, they're nice in California up to about 10%, because when it's solar, it's in the midday. That's when they have lots and lots of heat. That's where they have all the air conditioners on. So it's great for the first 10%. But then after that, it's not so great, because what are you going to do with all the extra power you have in the middle of the day? And what are you going to do at night when you actually need some power? And there's no good way around this. Just one statistic for you. If you look at, people will always tell you, oh, batteries. If you take all the batteries in the world, they can hold electricity compared to how much electricity we use on average on the planet for 1 minute and 14 seconds. So we can basically say when the sun goes down or when the wind stops blowing, we have batteries enough to keep us going for 1 minute and 14 seconds. And then we're back to relying on fossil fuels.
There's a very obvious physical limit to solar and wind, and also the battery power that would be required to make it a consistent energy. Let's go to questions from the audience.
Do you guys all agree?
I can't see anything. I think they're there.
No. Okay, good.
Yeah.
What do you think about nuclear fusion? I've heard some people say that you get toxic waste, but you get so much energy, it's worth it.
So fundamentally, my concern with nuclear is not the toxic waste. If you look at what we actually have, we have toxic waste from coal-fired power that's incredibly damaging. So basically, kills more than 500,000 people every year. All energy sources have negative impacts. People, when they put up solar panels, they'll, the people who install the solar panels will, slide. It's not slide down. They'll fall down and die. Not a lot of them, because then you wouldn't have any solar installers, but enough that this is actually a significant problem. The main problem with nuclear is not its safety. It's actually one of the safest ways of producing power. So, for instance, the Chernobyl, which is the biggest nuclear catastrophe we've ever had, the International Energy Agency and the EU and the World Health Organization and a few others made a 10-year report where they tried to estimate how many people have died in total. The answer is 200. It's not nothing, but it's a very, very low number. So overall, it's incredibly
States, it's zero.
Yeah, it's very close to zero at least. It's very, very safe, but unfortunately, new nuclear is very, very expensive. So when you put up a new nuclear power plant in Finland or in France or somewhere else, it turns out that they're incredibly expensive. This is because, to a very large extent, because we've just piled on regulation over regulation over regulation. You're not going to get rid of that. So an economist would tend to say maybe we should get rid of some of those, but that's just not
We're going to try. We're trying.
You're trying.
We're taking the majority in November. We're going to try. We're going to hit that problem directly. Yeah.
But a safer way to do this is fourth generation. So get the new nuclears, which are basically going to be assembled on an assembly line, going to be very modular. You're going to have the authorization pretty much up front, and that will potentially mean that they'll be incredibly much cheaper. Now, again, we need to see that. I'm very agnostic. I don't know what is going to win the world. If I did, I'd be a lot richer than I am. But one of these things is going to do it.
Yeah, and I would only add, we're definitely working on that. Republicans have a ton of legislation on the Energy and Commerce Committee that takes on that problem directly. You got to make it less expensive. You got to make it less expensive to permit it. People have been told for years how dangerous this technology is. The safety is not the problem. You can fit all the nuclear waste America has ever produced in one football field that's 8 stories high. All of it. It's a pretty low amount of waste, and it's not exactly dangerous either. I think people envision the green ooze from The Simpsons. It's just not true. It's like a metal cylinder that you can be near. It's not a big deal. So, it's a lot of education necessary.
Hi, my name is Lily Kate. I'm back again, Mr. Crenshaw. I think Mr. Bjørn, your name is very manly, and I like that. The other thing is, so we've seen a development in using blockchain technology, obviously with cryptocurrency, and so I'm interested in your perspective about using flare gas to obviously mine and basically facilitate the mining of the blockchain or crypto or whatever you use the energy for, in terms of like how that can actually positively affect the environment. And then Mr. Crenshaw, I was going to ask you, in Texas, obviously our main industry is energy, oil, and how are you going to empower and protect cryptocurrency users, blockchain miners, as they're coming into Texas?
Good question.
I'm sorry,
do you know
I
anything
have
about
a
that?
hard time. No, I'm having a hard time hearing.
She was asking, so in
Sorry about that.
some places in West Texas, because they flare a lot of the gas that comes
Right.
out, because there's not a pipeline system to bring it to bear. So what some people have innovated is they instead of flaring it, they'll actually use that to create energy to then power like Bitcoin mining, which is an extremely power-intensive operation. So, I don't have a really strong opinion on it, one way or the other. It seems great. Like, why not? If you want to get into a deeper conversation about Bitcoin and blockchain and digital currencies, I don't have an expert today on that, and I'm not going to make Bjørn try to answer that. I think it's interesting, right? I think Bitcoin and digital currencies are turning into sort of a mix between owning a stock and owning a currency. They're kind of a mix of the two because they're sensitive to supply and demand pressures the way a stock is as far as defining its value, but you can kind of trade it with one another a little different. So, the answer is fine, I guess. And in government, we've just got to figure out what is the proper touch there. I don't think a lot of people have great answers to that. Luckily, the future chairman of the Financial Services Committee is very smart about this, Patrick McHenry from North Carolina, younger guy, and he can answer your questions very well. I'm going to have him on the podcast to talk about this, too. You got any thoughts on that?
There's lots of arguments of how you can make things smarter. Fundamentally, there's a lot of ways that end up not being very effective. So I certainly want people to take a look at how effective is this. I'm a lot less sort of enthusiastic about Bitcoin. An economist will say that there's no actual value, but that's a whole other conversation. So let's leave it at that for now.
I'll give you one quick argument as far as supporting Texas's oil and gas industry. All right, because that was part of your question. And if you care about climate change, and you also care about Texas oil and gas, and so I care about both. Okay, well then let's look at what's going on in the world. You've got 50% of emissions globally that are largely because of foreign coal production, or coal-fueled power production. 50% of emissions, that's a lot. And so what generally displaces coal? It's just as an energy source. You can wish with all your might that it's solar and wind, and that these developing nations are just going to adopt that and build their electrical grids accordingly. Or you can do what makes sense and go to natural gas, which burns half the emissions of coal and is largely responsible, almost entirely responsible, for America reducing its emissions back to like 1992 levels. So what should we do? Export more American natural gas with all of our environmental standards that are up to standard, and actually displace the foreign coal that's actually producing so many emissions. If you quadrupled American exports, which the industry can if we just let them and stop messing with them, then it would have and that displaced coal. It would have the equivalent of putting solar panels on every home, giving everyone a Tesla, and doubling our wind capacity. That's an amazing statistic.
Okay. Mr. Bjørn, so we know that you're a professor of statistics. Now, I don't know if you believe the same or not, but my professor back at Texas Tech, he said that in statistics, the numbers can say whatever you'd like, given you work them enough, correct? Now, my question
You've got to enunciate really clearly because of the echoes. It's really hard for us to hear you.
Yeah, so, oh man.
Simple question.
I'm just wondering, is there any particular example of misuse of statistics in climate change that you've seen?
Oh, God, yes. I mean, you know the phrase, lies, damn lies, and statistics. It's very easy to mislead with statistics. And I actually mentioned one with the thing that Financial Times did when Hurricane Ian was here. They just noted all the number of named hurricanes. But of course, we're become incredibly good at naming hurricanes because we watch a hurricane from space, taking shape and then disappearing in 24 hours. If there wasn't a wooden ship out there, in times of old, you would never have seen it. So this increase that you see in number of hurricanes, named hurricanes, is just a spurious trend, and we know that. Likewise, there was lots of hurricanes in the 50s and 60s, early 70s, then it basically dropped down. We don't quite know why. So 70s and 80s were very, very low in hurricanes, and then we got back up to normal. So if you start in the 70s or 80s, which is very convenient because that's when satellites started to cover the whole world, it's very easy to get an increase, and that's exactly what New York Times just did. So if you take your starting point, or if you make your instrument in a way that makes sure that there's more and more trouble, so have you seen the, this is, I think it was started under Obama, the billion-dollar catastrophes, the index that tells you how many billion-dollar catastrophes does the US have, and it keeps going up and up and up, which of course is exactly what it's designed for. Why? Because as the US gets richer, obviously you will get more damages that are worth $1 billion. If you have twice as many houses, of course you have twice the damage from a similar kind of hurricane. And if you think about Florida, back in 1940, there were little less than 600,000 houses in Florida. Today, there's nearly 10 million houses. So not surprisingly, if you have a hurricane hitting there, you'll have 17 times more damage. And of course, each one of those houses is worth a lot more. And many of them have now been built in very, very dumb places. So there's sort of a trifecta of things. Look, people love to live where hurricanes hit, because when hurricanes don't hit, it's a really beautiful place to live, right? And then they would prefer the US government to sponsor them so that when their house gets hit, they can just rebuild it and wait for the next hurricane.
Yeah, we've run into that in the Houston area just a little. Another statistic I'll talk to you about, and if you're a follower of my podcast, Jesus, maybe 2 years ago, I interviewed Orrin Cass, did a study on this, on the statistic of the cost of climate change and how that's actually calculated. He found some interesting things. Primarily, the statistic value of a life. So that's an economic term, statistical value of a life. You are attributed some kind of economic value just based on living, right? Based on your economic output. And so there's a value you can put to that. And he thought it was odd that under these climate change predictions, that the cost would be so enormous. And what he found was they were assuming some pretty radical things. That if the temperature increased, by this much, that there would be, let's say a degree or 2 degrees Celsius, that a place like Philadelphia would have like 50 times more heat deaths than it did 50 years earlier. And that's an odd thing because, their new temperature is basically what we live with in Houston all the time. So how is it that Philadelphia, they just never heard of air conditioning? So there's some major assumptions that were very dishonest that were uncovered there. So yeah, you got to pay attention to statistics. It's a good question.
Howdy, my name's Noah Compton. I have a question for both of y'all, but I want to focus on what Mr. Bjorn said about innovation. So my question is, what can be done to educate youths about the importance of innovation, and more importantly, how can we equip them with the tools to innovate more effectively?
You got to tell your friends to come to my youth summit. That's how you do it. We also do a healthcare innovation summit every year. We do an energy innovation summit. I love the topic of innovation. I think it's interesting. We run kind of like we run this. I want it to be almost like a TED Talk. Like you're learning something new with every single time. So get people here next time. Let's expand it. Let's expand the movement.
I think the other answer is there's a lot of people who are incredibly worried. And although I think some of them actually are they're pretty resistant to being unworried about this, a lot of people really would like to hear, look, we're actually okay. There's a good reason to believe that this is not going to end in catastrophe. And if you tell them that message, not only does it happen to be true? It's also a really, really positive and uplifting message. There's a lot of young people, probably not here, but certainly many in Europe, who are desperately worried about the fact that they're going to grow up, and they have this vision that in 30 years or something, there won't be a planet to live on. That's a terrible outcome. Of course, it means you don't really need to go to school. You don't need to really care, because it's not going to matter anyway. And so actually giving people back the hope and realizing it's very likely that we'll be much better off. Global warming will mean we'll be slightly less much better off, which is not a terrifying outcome, and you can help make sure that we actually get even better with it through innovation, through all these things. So that's the hopeful message that I hope we can get out. But yes, it's hard.
One more question.
I was wondering, do you think liberals genuinely believe that conservatives don't care about or just flat out hate the environment? And no matter what your answer is, why?
I think they kind of, some of them, the answer is it depends. Some of them really seem to think that, yeah. You're probably in class with them. They're probably, some of which might be your friends. I mean, look, people in America have fallen into these categories and these bubbles of information, and so they just hear terrible things about us. I went to, I don't know what university isn't fully liberal. I mean, so there's some that are straight conservative universities, but so I did my master's at Harvard, I did my undergrad at Tufts, and I found out, especially at Harvard, because I was more political by then. My undergrad had not that many, in my time, not that many people talked politics on the campus, actually. It was very refreshing. I feel sorry for you guys. You have to deal with that. Everything's very much more politicized. But in my master's program, I learned they know nothing about what conservatives think. They really don't. And that's an advantage. It's not a disadvantage. One, you can help them understand if they're willing to listen. But two, you can learn a lot. You got to go and you got to listen and you got to enjoy the debate. And when your time comes, you'll be ready for it.
And my sense certainly, it's probably very different in Europe. And my sense is that people are just much, much more sort of uniformly worried across the board. One of the things that I try when I go out and give talks is to really convince people I'm not a bad person. I'm actually trying to do good here. And I think it's worthwhile to do that for a while. Some people, again, you're not going to convince. But really, work with people and look, I think it's wonderful that people care so much that they're willing to spend an enormous amount of money on, for instance, helping fix the environment. But we want to make sure we spend it well. And we also want to make sure that it's the right thing that we focus on, right? So one of the things that blow my mind is that there's no sense of prioritization. I'm just going to give 2-minute sort of spiel on what it is I actually do. This is not my day job. So my day job is I run a think tank called the Copenhagen Consensus, where we try to get people to think about where can you spend money in the most effective way. And that's not mostly in environment. That's about tuberculosis and malaria and the fact that half the world's population don't get good education. And we have very, very simple technological ways to fix that. There's also a lot of bad ways to try to fix it. Try to fix it in the smart ways. Get people to realize that there are a lot of things that you can do and you can't do them all, so shouldn't we do the smartest stuff first? The simple, obvious answer when it comes to environmentalism is the plastic straw? Really? That's your main concern? First of all, remember, the vast amount of plastics in the ocean comes from developing countries that don't have good municipal garbage retrieval. A lot of it comes from the fact that we decided as societies that we wanted to recycle plastic, but we were too cheap to actually want to deal with it when we collected it. So what did we do? We shipped it to China, and they don't take it anymore, or Vietnam or Philippines and other places. And not surprisingly, some of the people who bought this were like, it'd be expensive to bring it in and actually pick it apart. Maybe we just lose it at sea instead. What is actually the big problem with plastics in the ocean? About 70% comes from fishing equipment. Most of the rest come from industrial production. Plastic straws, 0. Why is it we worry about plastic straws? Of all the things that we could worry about. Again, involve people in talking about what can you do first. And I think a lot of people will think, you're still a little annoying, but maybe you also make sense, and maybe you also help us make smarter choices.
It's a great way to end it. Bjørn Lomborg, thank you so much for
Hey,
being
thank
here.
you very
We
much,
appreciate
guys.
you.
Thank you.